name is Sarah Zamarilai. I am a Paiute, Shoshone, and Pomo native. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a second-year intern at the AIRC.
Hi, y'all. My name is Julia Gavin, and I am a Diné and Blackfeet student intern, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Slang, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm not Native, but I'm the graduate student intern for the American Indian Resource Center this year.
Hi, my name is Desiree. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Danette, and I'm a second-year intern.
Hello, my name is Amanda. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am a Muskogee Creek, and I am also a third-year intern here.
Hello, my name is Kamiko Hostler, and I'm a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a first-year student intern. The director of the AARC is Dr. Hernandez. She uses she, her pronouns, and is Mescalero and Warm Spring Apache. Our program coordinator is Jenzy Ortiz. She is Northern Cheyenne, Lakota, Sioux, and Blackfeet, and uses she, her pronouns as well. The AIRC is dedicated to supporting the needs of American Indian students at UCSC. It is one of 6 resource centers on campus alongside ARC and APERC. Throughout the year, we host speakers, workshops, and presentations that raise awareness about issues that pertain to our respective communities.
We have disabled the video and audio for guests today in order to minimize distractions and disruptions during the presentation. Today's event will be recorded and shared on the ARC social media. The chat function on Zoom can be used to submit questions, so please submit any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and we will share them with Dr. Lee Francis using this method, and we will try our best to get them all answered. The next few slides contain what we're reading for accessibility reasons. And now we will do our tribal land acknowledgement. UC Santa Cruz is located on the unceded territory of the Owasso-speaking Yupi tribe. The Mutton Man, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to the missions of Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma.
So today we will be learning from Dr. Lee Francis IV. A self-proclaimed Indigenerd, Dr. Francis tells the stories of Native American superheroes and Indigenous icons through comic books. He is the founder of Native Realities, a publishing company that produces and distributes comics to children, youth, and adults. He is also the founder of Indigenous Comic-Con, now PopX, that brings together Native American creatives representing multiple art mediums. The rise of the Indigenerd coincides with concerted efforts by marginalized to assert themselves in establishing authentic representations within global pop culture. Dr. Francis's talk will explore the history of Native and Indigenous people in popular culture and highlight some of the amazing efforts of Indigenerds worldwide to actively change the representation of Native people through dynamic and powerful expressions of self and culture. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Francis with us tonight. You can go ahead and start.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, Goatsi Hapa, Tawat Yowashrap, Wahindume Lee Francis, Washesh Kawekame, Amerikaname, Washesh Apani Waschi. Good evening, everybody out there in Zoom land, out there in all our homelands. My name is Dr. Lee Francis. My family is from the Pueblo of Laguna. On my dad's side, on my mom's side from the Pueblo of Missouri. So I'm really glad to be able to be here to talk a little bit about natives and pop culture and what that means. My background really comes from education. I began my career as an educator out with the Pueblo of Laguna when I was in my mid-20s, teaching the people from my own home community at Laguna Acoma High School, and really being able to sort of explore our own history as Native folks. And while I was there, one of the things that I began to recognize was how little representation there was within sort of like this middle grades or this particular developmental realm for Native folks. My undergraduate was in theater, so I had already been studying Native folks and the, Native representations in the theatrical world, which is really the origins of popular culture and mass media within, especially the United States and the burgeoning United States. And so when I got out there and I began teaching, I recognized that there was this big gap. And it started with, you would have like kids books, early literature, some picture books, some native, some non-native, and then you kind of had maybe like 1 or 2 YA books, and then you just jumped right into adult literature. And that continued to develop. There was more YA books that were developed. There was more that came in. But all of a sudden, you're expecting young folks to jump right into stuff like Louise Erdrich and, Scott Momaday. I mean, I read Scott Momaday in high school, but some kids and some of the kiddos and some of the youth aren't quite ready for that because there's no scaffolding to build them. And when I really started to break down, I was like, you know what? I grew up on comics. I consider myself an Indigenerd. I love comic books growing up. And I started to see that there were really no comics that were representational for my students and for Native folks, really in general. Now, that's not to say that there was absolutely zero, but there weren't any that really hit the mainstream. And if they did, there were no real Native comic book writers in that space. I will get, at least as I was growing up, there were, but I didn't know that. And I didn't know that at the time. And definitely, even when I began teaching, I wasn't entirely sure what was out there. It took a little bit of research, and you had to do a little bit of digging. So that was kind of what started this exploration of where I needed to go. And 2015, founded Native Realities as a publishing company. It sprung out of Wordcraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers, which is now almost a 30-year-old organization that my father founded, that I now direct, and that now houses all of the endeavors that we do, from Red Planet Books and Comics, the only Native comic shop in the world, Native Realities, and the Indigenous Comic-Con, Indigipop X. Because really, the idea was, how are we trying to change the representations of Native people by utilizing pop culture, through pop culture and around pop culture? And it becomes really important because pop culture is not simply what we know as, like comic books and Sunday cartoons and, and some sports stuff. Pop culture has such a profound and prolific impact in terms of the American, the United States, and Western psychological, psychology. And that psychology really has been determinant on how policy has been made against Native folks often, and how we think about what I term as the invisible struggle. And so that's where we'll begin. I'll share my little screen right there. As the invisible struggle. So this is really what I'm talking about tonight, which is Native Americans in pop culture, the invisible struggle. And now it's an invisible struggle because it's something that we don't often recognize. It's the way that pop culture often works, is that it's not something that is that we think about. It's something that permeates the collective consciousness in a way that all of a sudden we're just influenced by it, whether we mean to be influenced by it or not. If you think about, all the kids that are running around in this world in Spider-Man pajamas, some of these kids don't even know who Spider-Man is. They drop, they just wear these pajamas and they're just like, oh, they just look cool. And so pop culture comes into this way in a way that really affects all of us, but often, often is under analyzed. Now, one of the things that we know is that Native folks throughout this time have existed in a realm of pop culture, because our existence was very much trapped in a historicized interpretation of Native people throughout American history, but really thinking around the Westerns, right? So our Plains relatives and how they were, they were represented in film and television. The incredible book, I think it's Real Indians or Real Indians, or the documentary, the documentary goes into this in detail. It's fantastic. But I always premise, I'll say, and I also premise that it goes deeper than just film and television. Native representations go back to the origins, the foundings of this country, of the United States, and even before. And that's when it starts to get really interesting around how we perceive Native representations. So I always like to start off like this. When there's a crowd and I can see everybody, I'll know who this is. And if you don't, that's okay. It's a little pop culture, little old school pop culture reference. Thomas builds the fire. I always love this because I think he's like a superhero. He takes that shirt off and he's got the fry bread power on there. So it's one of my favorite images to start with when we think about Native representations and in some ways Native superheroes. So there's old Thomas. He brings this, and if we kind of recall, for those of us that saw this when it came out, I saw smoke signals in the theater, how impactful this was, because it was a mainstream media release of Native folks as the heroes. There were like one non-Native in that movie. So it was really, really impactful. And especially when I would go and talk and be like, hey, I'm a Native person. And people are just like, oh, did you see smoke signals? So this was in the 90s, but it was how it became representational and dynamic. That was an interchange. So it was really, quite profound and transformational in terms of the pop culture representations. And then it kind of fell off a cliff because we haven't seen a lot like that in a while. Now there's a lot of indie films, which I'll talk about, but mainstream stuff has been few and far between, where it's truly significantly only Native heroes. So what I want to address first is really looking at three particular areas in how we look at Natives in terms of pop culture representation. And it is around identity, authenticity, and erasure. Identity is who tells the story. Authenticity is how the story is told or how they tell the story. And erasure is who is not in the story. And it's really important to understand these three areas and how they work off each other, because this is what there's a constancy in the ways in which Native folks today in the modern era are playing off of these three particular concepts. So in the early days around identity, Native people didn't tell their own stories. And so there was this, the academics, the anthropologists, the archaeologists were telling the stories of Native people, not only about our own history, but even our traditional stories sometimes. And so we really have to analyze who is telling the story, who is creating the imagery, how is that imagery synthesizing, and what impact does that have? Then we move into authenticity. When we talk about authenticity, it's how is the story being told? What are the nuances of that story, of that representation of Native people within that popular culture sphere? There are non-Natives that we know that have visited our communities, that have been respectful, that have gained the support of the community in a way that they have a particular authenticity, they understand, and they recognize their own flaws, that they're not bringing the same type of understanding that you would, being a Native person, growing up within a Native philosophy or ideological structure, as well as, and even the divisions of the folks that grew up on the res versus the folks that grew up urban. I'm an urban. So there's that authenticity of how are they telling that story? Not only who's telling the story, but then trickling down to how are they telling that story? And thirdly, then we have to look at the erasure. Who is missing from the story? And how are Native folks being removed from many of the stories? This is one of our biggest complaints when we think about American history, is we cease to exist in 1890. There has been so many other Native contributions throughout the last 150 years. The Native folks are so very little, they're not mentioned at all. Our folks are not mentioned in these spaces, especially regional folks that are not mentioned. Pueblo folks are mentioned like in tourism in the early West when the cars were going through. And I'm like, hey, Laguna was the largest contributor to uranium in the world in the 1950s. Like, that's a huge thing, but that's not mentioned. It's not mentioned in New Mexico history. It's not mentioned in US history. So who is removed from the stories? So when you have this triangle going, there's a real reason to be able to look at this. And I just posted this question on my social media, on my Facebook page, because I wanted to ask about what was happening. Oh, this slide didn't show up. But we're having these conversations right now between representation and erasure, authenticity and erasure, with Mia, the Land of Lakes butter woman, right? This is really important because she's a pop culture icon. Now, whatever your thoughts are on this, we get into this dynamic of how we have to begin to explore representation, poor or otherwise, and erasure, and what that means for our own people, for our own communities, and our own societies. So here's the history lesson. That's the broad overview, and it frames what we're looking at here. So this particular slide right here, This is the origin of the native in pop culture. This is our noble savage, the noble savage. The first mention of the noble savage happened in the mid-1600s. John Dryden, the English playwright, mentioned or created the archetype of the noble savage in his play called The Conquest of Granada. And this particular character was always used as a counterpoint, as an offset to the English, this noble savage, right? The nobility that the English loved, but also a savage because he wasn't English, white, could come in and was always, you know, used as like, oh, look at you, you terrible, you know, English person. Even the native, the savage is better than you, right? So it was all, the native identity was established in Western literature as a counterpoint. Now we can go back a little bit farther before the fictionalization of this, and we can see the same thing that's demonstrated within Columbus's records. This idea of, you know, the sort of frolicking forest nymph, the people that were so in touch with nature and so beautiful, and he wrote about them so eloquently right before he murdered them and enslaved them. But that's where the archetype was established. This is what we begin to see. Now there's some really keen features that are then associated. And now not only do we have the literary value of what's established with the character in poetic verse, now we begin to start seeing the artistic, and the imagery that gets detached becomes so significant. And I know y'all can see exactly what I see every time I look at this image and every time I present on this particular character. There's the headdress. So moving from the top to the bottom, you have this headdress. Not all natives wore this, but it became the archetype for native identity, a feathered headdress, using garish colors, something that showed the exoticization of the native identity. Moving down, you see the tattoos, right? Both on the man and the woman, but on the man, the noble savage, the male, we see the tattoos. And this is something the English wouldn't have done. So showing this exoticized, tattooed body. Although we know that traditionally and historically, that's a part of our culture, cultures, right, of where we come from. We also know that the way that they're used here are not necessarily as an entirely historical representation. What else do we see? We see the man with a parrot. I have my headphone case right there. I'll sit that on there. A parrot on his finger. As this idea of affirming the connection of native people with the natural world and imbuing the noble savage with a type of mysticism, magical ability to speak to nature and be one with nature. Now, we know historically that's because, like, we existed in balance and harmony. We figured out how to not, you know, destroy, you know, the world around us. However, this becomes essentialized and boiled down to this dude's got a parrot on his finger and he can talk to it and it'll fly and take things. And we see this later on when people, you know, the native folks always have like a spirit wolf or some sort of animalistic representation. So be aware that that's what we always see with native folks, right? There's an animal spirit that associates within pop culture. We also see my man right there, you know, he's absolutely, I'm not gonna do anything with my shirt, but like he is just ripped. You know, he's got the six pack rolling the entire time. And a particular type of physique that I have never achieved in my entire life. And I was an athlete and I was still round and brown, as my dad liked to put it, you know, like Pueblos, we're just barrels with legs. So what we see is this particular physique, and it becomes important to understand that this physique is to showcase the power and masculinity of the noble savage and native identity. You don't want to go and colonize or conquer a people and you got the B team. You want the biggest, baddest, most amazing looking guy that there's going to be. So when you colonize and conquer that person, it showcases your own masculinity by example, even if it is like a false understanding. We know that humans come in multiple shapes and sizes. We know that our folks were probably built with pretty solid physiques because they had natural diets, they were running, they were, you know, moving through a lot of spaces. They had a much more active lifestyle than the English did, but here it comes. The last thing that we see there is the bow and arrow. This is one of my biggest pet peeves. We know that native folks throughout history, when they have had their hands on weapons, guns and rifles, have been absolutely stellar and amazing with those because it's the middle of a war. They are fighting for their lives. But what we associate with the native is the bow and arrow. And this bow and arrow becomes so significant that in many representations, the native will eschew the white man's devil boomstick, the weaponry. I don't trust that. I will trust my trusty bow and arrow, right? And that sets up this false dynamic of native people really being backwards and savages. So we continue to reinforce the noble savage concept, and that they don't understand how modern weaponry works, which is really not even true within the historical record, is that native folks, when they got their hands on guns, they were going to use them, and they used them effectively in efficiency. We simply didn't control the means of production, so we didn't have a lot of the resources, such as bullets, to be able to continue using that weaponry. Now, let's shift over real quick to our native woman. The variation of the noble savage that we have here. Oh, there's my previous slide. There's our Land O'Lakes woman. This is a good example of that. I'll come back to that. Is our Pocahontas. So the noble savage variation is the Pocahontas right there. We see very many of the same dynamics. We see the tattoo. We see the jewelry. So we create this, this very model-esque version of this woman, where she has she got her necklace, she got her bling like she's going to Indian market. Her hair is totally like permed out. It is blowing in the wind constantly. And I will tell you, I taught Native American children's literature. We taught the Disney Pocahontas. If you go back and watch the movie, her hair is literally always blowing in the wind, nonstop. She has a personal wind machine through the entire film, right? But one of the other things that we notice is how much this represents and associates. Even in the modern era, this came out in the 90s, and we can still see these representations. Look at the over the shoulder. The women are always represented in native women are represented in this buxom, very full-figured kind of way. There's this idea of motherhood that goes with the character, the tattoos, the exoticization, and the long hair that goes with this, and these continuance of being used as a counterpoint for English women. Look, you English women who are asking for rights and property and all the rest of that, the native women take care of their families. They're the ones that do this, and you need to act more like them. The other part that comes into play that becomes even more insidious is that we can see the direct representations of how native women have been exoticized and objectified since 400 years ago. And what this points to is a direct line between that time and our active movements around missing, murdered Indigenous women. We see how this can actually affect when we permeate the collective consciousness with an objectified vision of Native women, and then we subsequently remove them from history because we don't talk about a lot of Native women. We can see exactly how we get to this point right here, right now. This idea of the over the shoulder, this sort of sexy alluringness of this Native woman, of Pocahontas in this space, and how she's in service of John Smith, which again, the historical record does not fit any of this, but this is the pop culture representation that we have to deal with. So we move from this particular space throughout history into our next time frame. So this is the early 1600s to about the early 1700s, the noble savage. We move into our next era, which is called the Vanishing Indian, or the last of the Indians. And you can put whatever term or tribe you would like to in there, because 7 playwrights did exactly that. During this time frame of about 75 to roughly a century, but about 75 years, up to the early 1800s, there are no less than 7 different plays that feature the title, The Last of the Blank. Now, most of them are dovetailing off of the pop and the popular nature of what happened with James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, where he tells this sort of fictionalized version of this native tribe. And what I've termed and what the scholarship shows is the concept of transference, or pop culture Indian transference. Now today we talk about it as like, maybe red face, or we talk about it as like, white folks coming in, like, and stealing native identity. We see a lot of this on YouTube. We see this in Europe. We see it in Colorado, where you got all these like Boy Scouts that are doing like traditional Pueblo dances, or sacred dances, right? So we see this, but this has a precedence right here in this book, where we have the white character, the main character, Hawkeye, and you have the native character. The white character has lived with the native guy, and he's come to understand the native ways. And while the native folks are dying off, the American gains all of that noble savagery, all of the magic but still gets to have the privilege of being the white guy, right? So it's this idea that he's going to carry on these traditions after we've wiped out and obliterated all the native folks. The non-natives, the white guy, the English, and the Americans are going to carry on our traditions for us. And it's sad. They'll shed a tear and they'll be really mad at their friends, but all the natives have disappeared. So we see this consistently. If you go back and like the movie actually does a much better job. It is one of my more favorite movies. In terms of the representations, it is a guilty pleasure. I'm well aware of the significant problems in the histories, but compared to the book is just, is literally, if we're talking about native representations, is a straight up dumpster fire. Like it is absolutely just, you know, it picks all the stereotypes. I saw an illustrated version of it when I was up in Colorado at a used bookstore, and I was just like, whoa, I didn't even know this existed. And I was like, I kind of have to put this down. This is like kryptonite. I got to leave. Because it was just, you know, it was all of the stereotypes that we can imagine around native folks, where we begin to create these native villains, but also we have these native heroes that are transferring their power. And they're the last of. Now, why is this important when we understand this is that it looks at the representations of native people to change the understanding of pop culture. And this is where pop culture moves from being, say, a representation, art as a mirror to nature, and becoming propaganda. And we are dealing with a lot of propaganda in this age. And we can see a lot of the stuff of how this works with native folks. The propaganda that exists with native people right here is that they're all dying out. So you, as Americans, don't have to feel bad because look, you already got all their magic, you got their spirituality, and now you can also take their land and you can take all the things that belong to them to begin with because, well, they're dead. So it's okay, you don't have to feel bad. And I, for one, tend to believe that people, whether they exhibit these traits or not, understand, have a moral compass. They understand right and wrong. Now, again, whether they practice that or not, that's up for different deliberations. We can do that in a different talk. What we can know is that we create propaganda to be able to assuage the fact that we have to eliminate the humanity from other folks so that we can gain what we are looking to for our own community, the American community, not my community, but the American community, especially during westward expansion. And this is what this type of medium does. And so then when it's perpetuated as a very popular book, and especially with all these plays, which was the mass media of the day, because it's a burgeoning literary society in the United States, theater is a one direct way to communicate to the masses, especially with touring and traveling exhibits, we get to this particular space. So almost overnight, we move into a new realm. 1824, Andrew Jackson is elected president of the United States, and it is open season on native folks. And it moves us from a period where the noble savage continues to exist to where the noble savage continues to exist to where he takes a very hard left turn into what we term the Red Devil. As manifest destiny and westward expansion begin to happen, the American psyche can't take a noble savage any longer. It can't take a popular character that has sympathies, because we need to turn our sympathies away from that character. So what we need is a villain. And that villain embodied in this particular character, one of the most popular books at the time in the mid-1800s, Tom Sawyer. Now, a lot of the modern generation does not have to read this. We've kind of removed it from American literary canon because it's problematic in a number of ways. But when I had to read it, and I had to read it in, I want to say, elementary school, one of the things that I didn't quite, it never sat right with me, but I didn't quite recognize until later on that the main villain, the antagonist, is Injun Joe, right? He is a half-breed. So we start establishing this term as something that's villainous, almost like, you're mixing races, right? And as the true boogeyman of this particular story. In the image that you see at the bottom left, my left, I'm probably sure you're right, you can see Tom dreams as part of one of the chapters. Tom dreams that Injun Joe sneaks into his bedroom to murder him. And of course, if you remember the end of the book, Becky and Tom, are chased by Injun Joe into the caves, and they escape, and they leave Injun Joe to die in the caves. Metaphorically, if we're looking at it from a native lit or lit crit perspective, we can look at it and basically say what Twain was writing about was the death of the indigenous America to make way for the new America. Tom, as this young rascal, he's a go-getter, he's an entrepreneur, he's a con man, he's a huckster. Sounds kind of familiar. He's sitting there and, you know, he whitewashes the fence, he does his whole thing, and at the end of it, the Indian dies in the cave, doesn't even get what we'll say is quote unquote a warrior's death. He doesn't get a face-to-face fight. He dies in the middle of a cave. So we see this as the native now being the villain of the stories, the boogeyman showing up in the middle of the night. And the American populace needs this to reinforce manifest destiny, to understand that if the natives are always trying to murder you in your sleep, you need to make sure that you get there first. Because it's America and manifest, we got to get coast to coast. And so pop culture stops being just a reflection and becomes that reinforcement. It's not a commercialization, it's a propaganda machine. And so the Red Devil perpetuates and permeates for probably the next 100 years. This is the villain that is part of every John Wayne Western. It is the Red Devil. The Noble Savage only kind of shows back up again when they are in service of the manifest destiny, right? So it's the natives that recognize that they have been defeated, that everything is terrible, and they are going to help out against these other villains, you know, this villainous Injun Joe. That becomes the good Indian, bad Indian motif. And we see that a lot as well. What we also see is the subsidiaries from the Red Devil in this particular character, which is the drunken Indian and the lazy Indian, right? So you see the drunken Indian is the one that is like still is a villain because he's too drunk to help out, can't do anything. And the lazy Indian, almost the same, except not drunk, but usually kind of drunk. So you see these particular characters that are subsidiaries within all of this Western iconography. So the Western is really birthed on this idea of the Red Devil. And we see this even when we move into the next era. And this is really the last era. This brings us up into the modern era, and I like to showcase this guy. The modern era of native representation is what we like to call the tragic chief or the neo-noble savage. And the tragic chief has always has a tragic backstory because people have been, either reservationized or, decimated or whatever. And it is constant sorrow. And what we start to get into is this perception of the reveling in tragedy, this fetishizing of tragedy. And this happens for a good century, and we see it till today. What began to change, though, around this, and I think why the pop culture began to change, was that Native people at the turn of the century began taking their own stories into their own control. We had some folks in the mid to late 1800s that began to write. Mourning Dove, Christine Quintasket, Charles Eastman, Ohiesa. We began to see that they were getting published, and so Native stories were coming in because there was this ennui, right? That ennui for sort of the old Americana, and that natives were being decimated, and so there was this sort of like morality that went with it of like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that. So as Native folks who have now been in the 1800s forced into boarding school, they're now accessing higher education, they're accessing college, they're now being able to write, they're accessing the publishing industry, and so you see the shift. You see Darcy McNichol, you see Green Grow the Lilacs, you see, all of these particular Native characters that are writing, whether it's, whether there's an undertone of nativeness or overt nativeness, traditional stories or autobiographies or whatever, that starts to happen all the way up until the 30s and 40s. And of course, then we really start to get into civil rights. We see Native folks and the Code Talkers. We see, from World War I to World War II, and then into the 50s, where we start to really see the burgeoning Native literary community begin to develop. And so with that, you see this change, but the change can't quite get away from all of the previous generations of Native representations. So we call him the neo-noble savage or the tragic chief. They have this tragic backstory. It's totally idealized and identified in Burt Lancaster's Jim Thorpe, right? The Jim Thorpe story. And Burt Lancaster has the Jim Thorpe, and he has to choose, between he's a traditional, but he has to live in the modern era. So now you get this whole, this reinforcement of the duality, right? Of living in two worlds and how that works to live in two worlds. And that becomes this whole dynamic of the ways in which Native folks are being framed in popular culture. There's a number of plays that come out in the early turn of the 1900s, up to about 1920 or so, that really feature like a Native man, of course, is a chief, or he was a chief, or his dad is a chief, and he's supposed to be the chief, and he's going to, some Ivy League school, and he's dating, a white woman, and he has to sacrifice her so he can go back to his tribe. There's a lot of these representations that show up over and over again, which also creates this very interesting binary about how Native folks are supposed to exist, right? Because traditionally we've been like, man, she's just gonna come home, she's gonna meet with mom, she's living with us now, right? But not in the movies. And obviously for all the reasons that we know, you know, within mixed race identity that we saw back in Tom Sawyer, we still can't see this right now. So we run into all of these variations. And that culminates really in how we approach the 60s and the environmental movement, because we go back historically to the Native being connected to nature. And then, and lo and behold, we get the crying Indian. And the crying Indian, the image you see before you, obviously not Native. Iron Eyes Cody, he's Italian. And he, you know, this is your typical red face, but he looked the part for Hollywood. And it's all the commercial, for those of you who don't know, somebody throws trash out of their window, rolls up at his feet, and it pans up, and he's got a single tear rolling down. And the Native then became the icon for the environmental movement, which continued to put Natives in this idea, or this situation, that they were just the representatives of this unbridled, you know, romanticized notion of Native identity. And so you get this really, so you get this schizophrenic split between the Native that is the romanticized Native, and you get the split that is the tragic Native. And so that's why we say it's the tragic chief or the neo-noble savage. And they sort of butt heads against each other. And this becomes really critical when we look at, oh yeah, and there's the Simpsons. Obviously, you know, you've made it into the pop culture realm if you show up on the Simpsons. It's actually a really hilarious episode that happens because then the Native guy looks behind him and it's all this trash and he just like screams. It's pretty funny. You know, I can recognize it. You know, some of the stereotypes that are there, but still amusing because it's playing off of this particular concept. So when we think about all of these representations, and especially in the 50s, because the 50s is really where we begin to establish the iconography, not only in the media, the film and television, but then all of the subsidiary merchandise, which is comic books, toys, games, collectibles, etc. Right? So that's the realm that I operate in the shop that I run. But you can see all of these. You can see Tonto. Some of these titles are great. White Indian, Rex Weiler and the Apache Kid, Scalp Hunter, Red Wolf, Straight Arrow. Right? And these are the times when Native folks are actually as the heroes of these stories. Interestingly enough, half the time they're not Native. Scalp Hunter and White Indian, not Native. Firehair, White Daughter of the Sioux, also not Native, right? Playing on the whole captive narratives, and that's a whole different line of literature about Native folks. So you begin to see how this permeates. And one of the parts that we see also that I point with Tonto is that, you know, you have the Lone Ranger, you have Tonto. Tonto got his own story. But even during the 50s, the most watched television show in the 50s, a third of the population of the United States at the time was Davy Crockett, right? Disney, you know, banked on this. They put their live action stuff and they put together a powerhouse of Americana. And that's why everybody had the coonskin caps. The 50s, you know, solidified the way that Native folks exist within popular culture, because most folks don't remember that it's Davy Crockett and the subtitle is Indian Fighter, right? So now we see how this, if a third of the population is watching the show, and the other third of the population is buying the merchandise because that first third of the population got it. And then you got that last, that's almost the entire country that has a view of Native people as you're either helping Davy Crockett or you're against Davy Crockett. If you're against Davy Crockett, you're a villain. If you're helping him, you're a good Indian. And so this is how it permeates through the pop culture. Now, here's the change. In the 80s, this stuff began to shift. And it was really important because we began to see a lot of these representations as Native folks began to take control even more of the stories. We'd already moved into literature, and we had created Pulitzer Prize winning literature. We'd created, you know, New York Times bestsellers. And so now we began to move into this realm where the images now were also solidifying, because that's the thing that we have to remember. As much as we've been involved in literature for a century, we have had a harder time moving the image of the noble savage away from the concepts, even with some of the most incredible Native writers and the most incredible Native literature, because it's been solidified in the consciousness. So what we've had to do is then try and re-identify, reorient the collective brain, the collective Western brain, that that's not what Native people, all Native people look like, right? Not all Native people wear a headdress. Not all Native people are on the back of a horse. Not all Native people look like this. Again, check out the six-pack that he's got. There's the bow and arrow. Now, this was the Magnificent Seven. It just showed up. Martin Sensmeyer, great actor. I think he's fantastic. I've loved a lot of his other work, but look at how he's represented. This guy looks dope. He is ripped, but he's got his bow and arrow, right? He's got the leather. He's got a Native look. And again, they were being historical for the Western time period. But my big concern was like, man, why he ain't got a gun? Like, it's the West. He should have a pistol, right? So when we begin to see these particular spaces, this is what we start to get. Now, there have been some changes, some very dynamic changes by non-Native writers. We see this within comic books. We see this with our Inupiaq character. We see this with our First Nations Cree character. These are both out of DC. I think actually the top is Marvel, the bottom is DC. And these characters were, created in collaboration with Native folks. Still a few little hitches, because I always look at like, when the Native folks going to get to actually do their own representations, but we're making this progress within pop culture. We're still not necessarily seeing our own characters within the mainstream. We are, however, seeing some incredible work that's developing from our own people. So one of the earliest representations of Native folks by a Native person is Scout. Came out in the mid-'80s, Timothy Truman. Now the newest version is written with his son, Benjamin Truman. And it's a post-apocalyptic vision of America where the rest of the world doesn't want to deal with it anymore. And so they basically just shut off all trade and almost instantly turn America into a third world country. And the Native folks are kind of living in this sort of pseudo-corporatist Big Brother of Mad Max style arid landscape, right? So it's cars and guns and all the rest of that. It's fantastic. And it is actually it is probably the earliest comic book, like we'll say superhero representation, because there were other comic representations prior to this, but like superhero comic representation. So it becomes, it's positive, and it influences a generation of Native creatives. These are kids that, like me, they were kind of growing up on this. I kind of saw it like, I knew of Scout. I was like, what's this Scout about? Oh, this looks pretty good. I wouldn't say I was like a huge fan, because I still loved Iron Man at the time, but I knew about it. But there were a lot of other Native kids that saw this and were just like, this is amazing. Oh, we're so excited about this. Another character that I don't have a picture of is Mutton Man, that came out a little bit before this. And again, sort of different types of genres. It was a little bit more humor with Mutton Man, for those of you I didn't want to leave you out. And so that also had a strong impact on the people that were reading it and the people that were influenced. And so as we were influenced, as my generation was influenced by these comics that came out in the 80s, we began to start seeing how we started to play with the form. And so you started to see here in the 90s and the 2000s, you see Native manga, you see, coastal designs that begin to come in. And you see the ways in which those are shifting and perpetuating, where we're bringing in our own cultural art forms and art values and merging them with this form of sequential art, or what we call comic books. We also start to see that in the ways that we're making films and cinema at the time, right? So you're seeing Native representations in cinema by Native people. You think of Charlie Hill's Herald of Orange, you think of Powwow Highway, where there's a bunch of inside jokes because filmmakers are starting to write for Native folks, not thinking about how to write for a broader audience. These are kind of indie circuit types of things. And it's not really until Smoke Signals comes out where it finds that confluence. It's jokes that we all get, but also a really compelling story for non-Native folks to be able to understand sort of the Native identity and telling about Native folks in a modern context. That's one of the things that why I open up with Thomas Builds the Fire, because prior to that point, we really didn't see a lot of Natives in that kind of context. If I recall, it was 97, 98 when Smoke Signals came out, right around there. Somebody can correct me in the comments, I'm sure. But around that same time in the early 90s, both Last of the Mohicans came out, as well as Dances with Wolves. So you have two blockbuster cinematic representations that show up, that show historicized Natives. And so now you see modern Natives. And now you're taking these concepts and you're building them into this visual form of comic books. And so now you have these more modern representations. You have, the culture, the identity, these things that are pulling into these spaces. Now it becomes really exciting and dynamic. Then you begin to see a lot of these other things that are coming out about how we're telling our own stories using this graphic media. Adventures of the Chickasaw Kid tells about a native kid, Chickasaw, that time travels and has to try and remember all the stories that his grandfather told him, that at the beginning, of course, at the beginning of the book, he doesn't care about. He's like, I don't want to listen to your grandpa. Then he goes back through Chickasaw history. This thing had a run of, I think, like 12 issues, right? It was absolutely incredible. And here's the kid on the front. This is issue 4, but he's trying to remember what his grandpa says. He goes through these time frames and, and he's trying to learn. And so he tells Chickasaw history in a way that's graphic, graphically oriented, sequential art, and in a way that's so unique and dynamic, as a way not only to speak to our children and our young folks, but also in a way to speak to our own communities. And I think that that's what becomes so genius about the way that comic books start to represent, because then it spills out into pop culture, into the other representations. You see in the early 80s, after Scout comes out, or the mid 80s, you see Predator and Billy Soul in Predator. I have to say it's one of my favorite characters of all times in cinema, native characters, because, and yes, I recognize that he doesn't make it through the end of the movie. There's one of the strike against the movie, but he's the only guy that recognizes the danger based on traditional stories, because his people had already, like his ancestors had fought against the predators before, because they were originally the fiercest warriors. He doesn't have feathers. And he's basically just he's got long hair, but so does everybody else in that thing. And he's basically just one of the guys. And he's the last guy standing next to Arnold. And he gets the warrior's death at the end, because he's the one that stands up to the predator. Predator, of course, rips his skull and his spine out, but that was predator giving respect. So for me, like, we see that in the 80s. That's this huge, amazing representation of a native character, and not in the way that we began to see it right now, which is we're kind of like throwing native characters, or kind of like throwing diverse characters into cinema. I'm looking at you, Suicide Squad. In order to make, to be more diverse. I was like, that was pointless. This one actually was quite representational. You see the same thing. One of my other favorite cinematic representations in the 90s is Maverick. You go back and watch it. The whole native section with Graham Greene is probably one of the funniest sections I've ever seen in cinema, and it is so dead on, because it talks about how native people have been displaced. They've lost their land. They've only got this last bit, but they're poor and they're starving. And so the chief, Graham Greene, is doing whatever he can, and he's got some foreigner that wants to come out to have the authentic native experience, and it moves into this whole thing. It's like, what's the most authentic native experience? Kill Injun. Oh, and it becomes this and that's how they scam the guy out of the money. It is mind-blowing how good it is, and I will highly recommend going back and at least watching that section, because it is pure, amazing satire, as well as social commentary that I did not expect out of the 90s. But we begin to see the shift, because Native folks are now writing these stories. Native folks are now being more consultants into these particular spaces. We're seeing things like Moonshot, where you have Native science fiction, our traditional stories, which we already told of space, astronauts. I got my space shirt on today. We have star travelers, we have our star stories, we have, our people moving in it through galaxies and time traveling. We now take that and we move it into a comic form called Moonshot. This is my comic that I write called Six Killer. It tells the story of a Native woman seeking revenge for the murder of her sister. Again, going back to the images of Native women, it's very important to me that we create iconographic Native women that are basically gonna just get real stabby up on you. You ain't gonna mess with them, because we need to parallel what's been shown through popular media up to this point. In children's literature, I want to say up until about 2015, you can go on Amazon right now, and you can see that the majority of children's literature that feature Native women feature 2 Native women characters, Pocahontas and Sacagawea. Now, both of them, their stories, whether some are good, some are bad, some are terrible, both of those particular stories are often told, when they're written by non-Native folks, are often told in service of manifest destiny. And so we don't get to see Native women as being like the warrior women that they are, war women of the Cherokee, Lozen of the Apache. You don't get to see Native women in these spaces, because Native women are in service of the colonial empire, as we have set this archetype from 400 years ago. So a lot of the stuff that I write and a lot of the work that I do with this incredible artist, Wishoya Albitre, is how do we portray Native women as strong, as dynamic, and that they're gonna cut you, right? So that becomes really important for me and the work that I've done. This is another book that I worked on with Wishoya as well. Ghost River tells the story of the 1763 massacre of the Conestoga people. It is the last of the Susquehannock and Conestoga people in Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. One of the ways that we're trying to demonstrate how we can reimagine, reportray histories is that we don't fetishize the fetishize the tragedy of Native people, that we can tell something that happened historically that was significant, tragic, violent, despicable, in a way that still creates a mode and a means of empowerment. When I write and I draw Native folks into these spaces, or when I write, I don't draw, but when I write Native folks in these spaces, I'm always writing Native folks as standing up. They don't die, in screaming, as we see a lot of the linotypes from around the time. They don't die as victims. They are, it's their faces is the last thing that we see, because we're still here, we still exist. And so most of the comics I write always has our Native characters, our Native heroes at the end. They are front and center, and they are living, and they are vibrant, and they have carried on these traditions. So this story, although it tells about a historical tragedy in a comic book form, it tells Native folks from the perspective, using their own voice, which is also very important, but also to be able to reorient the story to not focus on the dead and dying Indian, but focus on the living. As we are a living tradition, we're living people, and we're still here. You can see this kind of magnificent work in Elizabeth LaPensée as we move into video games. So not only in the pop culture of comic books, but our video game world, our video game existence. This is Thunderbird Strike, where it's a game where you just essentially just win. There's no losing for this. You're the Thunderbird. You're bringing traditional animals back to life. You're striking down, bulldozers and pipelines, and you're saving your people. You're saving the people, as the Thunderbird does, to bring blessings down upon the folks, right? And it's a great game. And Elizabeth's such a great artist. This is her original art, and such a great game builder and creator, and so thoughtful. Dr. LaPensée. I have nothing but high regard for her, but you can also see how we're telling our own stories in ways that become fun and fascinating. And that's also the part of pop culture, is that there's a lot of the academic that comes into this, and we're all academics, and academics, there's a capturing, and there's this objectivity that comes in, but the pop culture captures the fun. And so if we can capture that, then we can begin to reorient these minds. You can see this another Elizabeth LaPensée original called When Rivers Were Trails, which is the take on the Oregon Trail, except from the Native side, where Native folks are moving from Minnesota to California. I was very blessed to be able to write a couple of the campaigns, a couple of mechanics that you'll get to in this, and of course the art, again, by Wishoya Albitre, incredible art, and the work that's been done on that award-winning game. Edragor, if I got my other nerds out there that love them some role-playing games, I got it on my shelf right over there. This is one of the best. Alan Turner, African-American, and I think Lakota wrote this incredible allegory for Native identity that brings in epistemology, philosophy, ontology, and makes it a role-playing game, where your job as the hero characters are to try and weave the world back together. The world has been split asunder through chaos, and so your characters can choose, because it's a role-playing game, various various archetypes and classes and whatnot. But your job is to try and bring the world back together in a spirit of indigeneity, and through an indigenous mindset. It's a fabulous book. It's fantastic. Even if you're not an RPG player, still just read it, because it's just amazing. The world building is fantastic. We have science fiction. We have fantasy. Native folks are writing all of this. We're talking about indigenous futurisms, right? So the work of Virgil Ortiz in terms of fashion and how we're creating fundamentals around indigenous futurisms, what that means as we're beginning to explore that. And I have become much more excited and interested in indigenous futurisms, because I think it really encapsulates not only our past, it encapsulates all our past, our present, and our future as indigenous people, where we're going. Dr. Grace Dillon, Anishinaabe, Portland State University, she was the one that formalized the concept. She created the fundamental philosophical framework and the literary framework around Indigenous futurisms that has to do with slipstream, that has to do with time travel, but time travel Indigenous style, because we're always kind of slipstreaming because Indigenous philosophy is nonlinear and cyclical, so it spirals, talking about the idea of the Native identity is wedded to the post-apocalypse. We had our apocalypse. 90% of our population was destroyed in the span of 50 to 100 years, gone. That's an apocalypse, right? Literally, we're dealing with some of this stuff like right now. It's been a month and a half, 2 months, right? So we're seeing this, and the slipstream then connects us back to our ancestors, our grandparents. It talks about sustainability, but more for me, it talks about how we perpetuate Native people into a future time, because we have spent so much of pop culture being identified with the past. And so this idea of futurisms and how we play with this becomes key and critical in how we move forward in literature, in academics, in the academy, in our philosophical constructs, because it's the ways in which our ancestors always taught us too. We view onto the seventh generation. How are we viewing ourselves and projecting ourselves into the future? And it is an immediate counterpoint. And it allows us in many ways to get away from the constant push-pull that colonization and colonial literature has forced us into, right? There's this constant tension that exists of how we're writing against or for or by and about. When we begin to remove that, we can cast a future that becomes different about how we're projecting ourselves post-colonization, in utopic spaces. Most of my writing tends to be about utopia. It can be a dystopic world, but the Native folks are the ones that haven't figured out, and everybody around them, all the Americanas, everybody else that's left, are all the ones that are falling apart, but the Native folks are the ones that have banded together because we figured this out early enough, because that, I think, is so key and critical. I think it's so important right now, especially now, to be able to give a boost, a morale, a heart, a soul, a spirit to our peoples out there that are struggling, but to recognize that they have this bright and infinite future ahead of them if we continue to persevere, if we continue to bring along what our ancestors taught us, what our elders are bringing to us, what our grandmas and grandpas have imbued us with. So that brings me to the end of this, and I think I am right on time at 50 minutes. So I will pull this cast. And you can find me in all these places. This is where we have everything. Native Realities, Red Planet Books and Comics, and DigiPopX. You can also look at wordcraftcircle.org, WORDCRAFT circle.org. That's where all of this is being housed right now. We consolidated everything under our ancient nonprofit. We're about almost 30 years. My dad founded the organization. I took over a while ago, and we're bringing all this stuff to you and really continuing to promote and support the work and words of Native writers, storytellers, and especially Native creatives in this field. So that brings me to the end. I'm excited to have some questions. But yeah, I will now officially stop sharing. There we go. And get out of there.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Francis. Yeah, at this stage of the event, we'd like to open up for some questions from the participants. If you can write these in the chat box, we will collect them from the submissions and ask them to Dr. Francis, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. Thank you for those who've already submitted. And yeah, let's begin.
All right. I love it.
Exciting.
And while we're waiting, I just want to thank all of you, students, interns, everybody, faculty, for allowing me to be a part of this. So I love being able to nerd out for an hour. It's always fun. So thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, so our first question.
Okay.
This person, first of all, says, thank you for the presentation. I am an Indigenous archaeologist at UC Santa Cruz, and I would like to know if you have any tips for finding comic book artists who might like to draw and write with archaeologists seeking to make their work more relevant and accessible.
Yeah, I'll just tell you, like, you can email me. I'll spell it very, slowly. Wordcraft.director, WORDCRAFT.director @gmail.com. I got a bunch of illustrators, folks that are looking to do some really great work. I would also recommend, there is a fantastic book, comic, and the name eludes me. I can see it on my shelf and I completely lost it. But if you email me, I can find it for you. That around NAGPRA and the work that they did they did a comic book around that up in Denver. The folks that did it were non-native that put it together, but they worked with native illustrators and Lakota folks up in the community. Yeah, it completely eludes me, but there's a great book like that. I think it would be really good if you could see that, and that would give you a really good example of how it could work. So just email me, and I can definitely put you in contact with some great folks that I'm sure would love to do something like that.
I've actually read that book for my Native American and museums class. So yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
Do you remember I can't remember the name. I can see it. The two guys are on the cover. It's a big, long title. We have 7 of them in stock. I cannot remember the name of it.
I can't remember either. Maybe I could find it later. But yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to figure it out. But email me. We'll figure it out. Facebook, whatever. We'll find it for you.
It's very good, very educational.
Fantastic.
The graphics are great. Yeah.
And it's done. And the thing that I think is really important is that it's done in a way that is very that's appropriate, right? Because it was non-native writers. But they did it right. They went up to the community. They're only allowed to print the comic on with the permission of the community. So we actually have permission to print it and run it at the shop. So we have been given that permission. They asked respectfully to be able to do that. They do not. It's not mass produced. So it's not a book that's everywhere. So I think it's done in such a way that I think honors what we're really trying to talk about when we say, like, not only are like you putting the representations out there, but when you are putting representations, be you native or non-native, when you're putting those representations out there, that you're doing it in a way that honors and is respectful to the community that you're trying to represent.
So great to hear. Yeah, it is really important.
It's dope. It's a great book.
Okay. So our next question is about the graphic novel Inde, A Story of the Apache Wars by Ethan Hawke. Yeah, we were talking about this before. And Greg Ruth.
Hold on, just 1 second. Somebody had it. Journeys to Complete the Work. That's what it is. That's the name of the title. It's popping up in the chat. So sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but we'll get to Inde. Okay.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Of course. No, this is important for the audience. Yeah, for sure. Yes. Okay. So yeah. Graphic novel Inde. Yeah. So yeah, it's by Ethan Hawke and Greg Ruth, and it tells the story of the last years the Apache were free on their homelands. Do you think comic books and graphic novels like this can help us accurately share the truth about Native experiences?
I think they can. This one in particular garnered, we're in this kind of space where when non-natives pick up stuff, there's always a hesitance, right? And what it kind of does, and I will say even intertribal, when we have folks writing outside of their own community, we begin to have to question, are they capturing the nuances? Are they capturing the story right? Have they done the research? What are they doing? I know Greg Ruth, the illustrator on it. He's a magnificent illustrator. He actually donated a couple of his photorealistic illustrations to us in our early days of our Comic-Con as part of a fundraiser book we did. I will say he's always down for the cause. He's an ally. Like he knows what he's doing and what he's talking about, and he walks the walk. I will say that Ethan Hawke. I think there is. I think it was written as well as could be from an outsider's perspective. I think Doug Miles gave the intro for it, if I recall correctly, and I think that was. That I think is also really key, that you get that kind of buy-in. My take on it is this, and it's not necessarily, I think, to the question itself, I think it can be very helpful as an intro step, because my main goal in all the work that I have done is to privilege Native folks to tell our own stories. So whereas I very much appreciate that the story is out there, because this story kind of gets buried in the whole Geronimo, Western motif. This actually had a lot more nuance in the space and was so beautifully illustrated. But my follow-up question is always, great. How did it inspire the next generation and is Ethan Hawke going to help put a Native writer into that space? This guy sold a lot of books. Great. Are you going to put a Native writer into that space? Is there a Native illustrator that you're going to be able to, is Greg Ruth going to be able to help and put them into that space so that they can sell those books and so that we as Native folks can tell our own stories and have the same access and privilege as our non-Native folks when they get the best-selling lists, right? When they get the big six-figure deals, and some of them, again, some of them are really well written. Some of them are very, incredibly historical. Some of them are trash cans. There is a new comic, a guy was putting it out on the web about the Tongva folks. It was a half Tongva woman, and she's murderous. And it's absolutely foul. I'm not gonna link it. If you go on Twitter, you can look it up and find it. It's terrible. And most of Wishoya, who's my illustrator, who's Tongva, who's the illustrator I work with. I'm her writer, I guess is actually more of the case. It was despicable. And the guy was defending himself, and he's like, I researched this for 10 years, and it's my love letter to California, in Southern California. And it was just like, yeah, dude. And in fact, then the whole truth came out that he had a Native consultant, an elder from the community that basically he's like, well, I had a Native consultant that helped me out. And then people found out that the Native consultant basically told him not to write the book, told him to stop writing, right? As an elder being like, no, dude, this is trash. And he just went ahead and did it anyway, right? So,
it's already violating that ethics, that's a no-go.
Right. So the way that I stand for it is, when it's done right, it's great. And I actually, if it's done right and if it's done in the spirit of the community, I wrote Ghost River. That's not my people. The Susquehannock, the people on the Lenape people are not my people. My people are Pueblo. They're here from, New Mexico. That's a totally different people. It's green. There's lots of rivers. It's, it's trees and, mosquitoes everywhere. Right. But I went out there with Shoyo. They brought us out there and we met with the people. We talked with the people and we asked for their blessing to be able to tell their story. So I think something like Nde is good. I thought it was really beautiful. I think it tells a part of the story, but I always got to add the ... And the next part is, okay, and where's our Native folks going to be getting that kind of a deal where they get that hardback book and they get, they get all the accolades, they get all the, all the press, right? That's the next step for me, as always.
Yeah, greatly said. Let's see. Ooh, okay. So this next question is, I'm curious about the differences between Canadian and US pop culture. I'm thinking specifically of the show North of 60 that came out in the 90s on CBC. I think it was one of the best shows on Indigenous people I've seen to date. Have you heard of it? I mean, I'm seeing some recognition there. Have you heard of it? And if so, what do you think about it?
I have not. I've heard of it. I won't say that I've gotten deep into it, but I will say that Canadian pop culture, and for all the problems in so-called Canada with our, our First Nations brothers and sisters up there, a lot of the stuff that they've put out has been far beyond what we've done here in the States, right? I mean, you already have Canadian publishers that have been publishing Native comics. When I say we're the largest publisher of Native comics in the United States, that's the ad, not in the world, just in the US is what we've done, because Canada is far surpassed us. The work by Richard Van Camp and Steve Sanderson, Blanket of Butterflies, that kind of stuff, man, they've been churning out that kind of stuff from First Nations. So I honestly think a lot of that, the Native interpretations or the Native representation in pop media outside of the US tends to be pretty fantastic. I will say in the 90s, one of the exceptions to the rule was Northern exposure. Really love Northern exposure. Not Native main characters, but very much a sort of a Native centric, right? So I thought that one kind of had some similarities. I will also say that the stuff that Canada's still producing, the stuff that, our brothers and sisters over in Australia, then they already got a Native superhero, Clever Man. So if you go, you can find it on IFC, you can bootleg it in some VPN places, and you can find Clever Man. It's an Indigenous superhero. right? And there was a comic book that came out from it. Like, they've been doing some incredible work. They got a Native sketch comedy show on your actual, like, your main television. It's called Black Comedy, right? So it's absolutely hilarious. Or was on, I think it's done now. I think they ran their seasons. But like, I was over there 4 years ago. Like, and it's on your main channels. It's not like you got to find it. It's not like you're, looking for the CW. It's their version of the CW, essentially. And it's like, but it's still there on your regular cable. So I want to say that in some ways, there have been some great indie stuff, like the Native film, film festivals, Sundance, the stuff that goes on there. There's always some great stuff that comes out of that. But in terms of hitting the mainstream, the US is like way behind, right? It's just a commercialized market. If it doesn't, and I will say this, knowing that this is way inflammatory, if it ain't historicized, and if it ain't dead and dying Indians, they ain't gonna put it up there, right? I think that's where they generate towards. And I say that knowing full well that the last 3 movies that came out for mainstream featured one variation of that or another. Hostiles, Woman Walks Ahead, Wind River, as significant, Native characters within a mainstream context, right? All featuring that sort of motif. Some of the television shows a little bit better. I think there's a little bit more. I want to say Westworld has been actually fantastic in terms of Native representation. There's a lot of critical analysis you got to do with it, but I don't think you don't got to twist yourself into knots. Obviously, anybody can take it in any direction they want to. That's why we're all scholars. But I tend to believe that it has some really good benefit. So yeah, First Nations, man, baby, they got the mustard. So
yeah, awesome. This actually transitions well into our next question, which is, in terms of stereotypical Native characters in video games, movies, TV shows, etc., how do you navigate your identity as both a consumer of this media and as an Indigenous person who recognizes that this representation contributes towards some of the oppression of your community?
Yes, absolutely. So this brings up, I was talking about this on the lead-in while everybody was kind of coming in. There's 2 ways to go about thinking about this, and I won't necessarily say I have an answer, right? So I want to come off with that right away. I think it goes to what Vine Deloria says, that indigeneity and the concept of being Indigenous is evolving. It's a process of evolution. It's a process of adaptation. It comes from colonization. We've had to adapt consistently for the last 400 years. And that's the thing that we're amazing at. So when we talk about Indigenous identity, we have to really, there's so many factors. One is a big factor, what I just talked about, is how much pop culture has influenced us in the ways that we formulate our own identities, right? There are many of Native folks, we know the statistics, we know that mascots have a detrimental effect, but there's a lot of our grandpas and grandmas that are fans of these various, Native mascots, right? That's their team, because that's what they built their identity around in a time and period when there was no other representation. So going back to the pyramid, right? Identity, authenticity, and erasure. And that erasure becomes so key and critical. And this was the question that I posed on my social media account on my Facebook page. I says, okay, you saw the Land O'Lakes woman, Mia, created that variation created by a Native guy, Patrick Desjardins, right? Is it better to have a bad representation or no representation at all, right? And somebody brought up this really keen point, and I'm still struggling with this. That's why I put it out to the crowd. I want some ideas. A key point of saying, the way in which Land O'Lakes decided to go about it was basically a missing, murdered Indigenous women, right? All of a sudden she's there, and the next thing you know, she's gone, right? Her time is up, right? The objectification, her objective has been met. She's titillated, she's exoticized, and poof, woman disappears, right? And I was like, yo, I never thought about that. Like, it just totally flipped my lid, right? To think of it in that way, because I was looking at being like, oh, it's a Native artist. So I was thinking about, like, let's not forget the Native artists, but then thinking about the idea of representation. So when we think about our identity, it's so complicated. And I don't know if I have entirely the best answers. I think the way that I have to frame this is in a theory that I've developed. It's called critical nerd theory. And for nerds of color, the idea is that there's a lot of pop culture representations of us, or not. And there's a lot of things we love. And sometimes those two intersect, and especially in poor ways. And then I have to figure out how I'm going to reconcile my nerdness in that space? Do I cancel Star Wars because the Ewoks are essentially the indigenous people and they're portrayed as little dummy, dummy teddy bears? And they really are. Like, if you get, George Lucas loved the Westerns. They are the Indians of the Western. Go back and watch it, y'all. Like, I watched it
You're making me
again.
think now.
The Ewoks are essentially, what do they fight with? Bow and arrow, spears, rocks, right? They're not as technologically advanced as the Empire. The Empire is the cavalry, is the folks that come in, right? They are helping out, this band of the Magnificent Seven, essentially, moving through their space, but they're all backwards. The first thing that comes down, they worship the golden god, the droid that come down into space. So they're savages. They're essentially the savages that help out the heroes to get to their journey, right? Now, we can argue this all day long because that's critical nerd theory too. And that's the fun part about being a nerd. It doesn't mean that I stopped liking Star Wars. It doesn't mean that I stopped liking Star Trek because they had some really terrible episodes with, Kirk being an Indian, right? You can go back and watch that, right? Falls in love with an Indian woman, buckskin and everything in the original Star Trek. Does that mean that I got to stop liking Star Trek? Critical nerd theory exists in this space. So when we think about the pop culture representations and what my identity means, I think it's really difficult because I try to put forward, I don't believe in erasure. I really don't, because we've spent too much time erasing our people. I believe that things can be retired. I think that we can, basically say, like, that's no longer acceptable. And then the next step, just like we need more Native writers, more Native creators, we need more imagery that's positive and that's representational. What do I got behind me? And Native folks that are writing this stuff. Darcy Little Badger, right? Writing Strangelands. Like these kinds of comics, this kind of stuff. What have I got here over here? Relational constellations. Native, this is like Native, not erotica, but like romance, right? So Native romance up in this space. So,
Wow.
These types of things, when we think of the Natives, in Native folks and our peoples in these representations, I think we really need to look for the best that we can get right now. And if there's nothing better, then we need to create it ourselves, because I can't wait for them to create it for me. I can tweet about it all I want. I can tweet about diverse books. I can tweet about better Native representations, but I ain't gonna do it. We need to create it. That's why I started writing comic books. That's why I write books. That's why I do what I do. I'm not gonna wait around for those folks because they're never gonna get there. They haven't. They've had 400 years, right? The last part to that is to say, when you're looking for it, remember there's nuances, right? I can look at something like Predator and Billy Soul and say that there is still stereotypes that exist. It's transference. It's the last of the Mohicans. It's a dead Indian at the end of the movie. I can believe all those three things. And I can also say it's still a great representation because he's a badass, right? Cuts himself at the end, takes on the Predator by himself, right? That's the kinds of things to look for when I'm looking for representation.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely some good things said.
Thanks.
Oh, so this next person is really excited to see some exclamation points. They say, great presentation. Will you be hosting any Indigipop X virtual events soon?
Yes, we're going to start putting some things together. We've been getting all of our pieces aligned because, everything, we went to the upside down in the last month and a half or so. So we did actually host, we did in our Indigenous Futurisms days, right? The same weekend we were supposed to do Indigipop X. So we put that online. We had like 8 hours of programming over 2 days. And then we're going to pull some of those pieces out. We're going to rebroadcast some of those pieces with some extra stuff. We're especially going to be talking around Indigenous Futurisms with some folks. We're trying to work. I have a grant that goes tomorrow around Indigenous Futurisms where we're going to be talking with Darcy Little Badger, Beth LaPonce, Tim Truman, those folks to talk about all of this. So we're going to continue to put this forward. Those are going to be like hour-long talks. And then when we start to get a little bit more momentum, we have another program called Conversations Indigenerd that came. We were able to do like one right before everything shut down at our shop. And essentially what we do is we take Native folks from 2 different fields that you wouldn't expect, and we put them together to talk about creativity and what it means to be natives and creative. So the last one we had Brian Hudson, Indigenous cyberpunk, Cherokee cyberpunk writer, professor at CNM, and Shaye Lucero from the Pueblo of Laguna as a florist. So we had a Cherokee cyberpunk and a Laguna florist having a conversation around creativity. So we're going to continue those. Those are our conversation, Indigenerd conversations. Those are coming soon. We're going to be trying to get everybody on. It's always trying to wrangle schedules now. So we're hoping to launch those in about 2 weeks. So check out wordcraftcircle.org, wordcraftcircle.org, and it'll be up on our new Native Realities digital site.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting.
The link is over there, so you'll find it there. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, well, we're approaching the end of our event, and we're on our last question. Now this one's a little loaded, so prepare yourself.
All right.
If you could have any superpower, what would it be and why?
Ooh, I love this question. Right now, I think, and I'm gonna give a snarky answer, and then I'm gonna give my real answer. My snarky answer, it would be, I would be Reason Man, and it would be that I could reason with people, and they would see reason. And they would all, like, we could all sort of be like, oh, you know what? We probably should all figure out ways to stay inside. And we should all remember to be a part of a community. Yes, thank you, Reason Man, for giving us your superpower. It'd be like brainwaves would go out like that. I think my favorite power that I look back, or that I look at more often than not is a water-based power, just because of what we're needing in this world. You know, it would be something that, like, you know, if we could bring water, bring rain, or bring, you know, a lot of this stuff to our communities, especially Indigenous communities, but really everybody at this point, like, that would be huge. So that would be my power. I would, you know, like I don't know, like thunder cloud or something. I don't know. I got to think of a better name, but that's what I'd be able to do. You know, and be able to bring those blessings to our peoples and to our folks.
Wow, yeah, those are some really great answers. I think we could definitely use both of those. Reason Man, especially now, just, yeah.
We'll get there. I think it's eventually, I think a lot of it is like, we try to reason on Facebook and that doesn't work as well as people think. But when we get the chance to reason with people in person, being like, hey, just like, think of my grandma. Like, yeah, I get it. I know I want a haircut too. Look, I'm, you know, I got my mad professor going on here, but like, I dig it, but I don't want to put my community at risk. And so I got to practice that. And I think if we can get to that point and kind of remember that we're all connected, that we're all here together, and that we're all struggling together, then it should, you know, hopefully it'll be better off, right? And we need more heroes. That's the other part. I love the superhero question because I'm always like, listen, you know, we still got monsters and we still need heroes. And the more heroes that we can write and create, the better off we're going to be.
Right. Yeah, greatly put, for sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Francis.
My sincere pleasure.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone, on behalf of the ARC Center and APIRG and the AIRC. Thank you for being with us tonight. And if you're interested in learning more about our future events, please follow us on social media or visit our website. And you can also sign up for our newsletters there. So, yes, so this is really important. Tonight's event was funded by Measure 15, the Community and Resources Empowerment Measure. Because of that, we ask that you please fill out an evaluation that will be sent to your emails at the end of the event, so we can continue making sure our programming is serving its purpose. And we have also put the link in our Zoom chat that you can click there. And yeah, thank you again, Dr. Francis, and thank you to everyone who made it out here tonight. Have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you again.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.